Welcome to the Design of AI podcast, the podcast for product teams. We interview leaders at the forefront of AI and provide in-depth analysis about the industries AI is transforming. Subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple. And join our newsletter to get resources from our guests, plus key insights and strategies to help your business. Get it on our website, designof.ai, or Substack.
AI gives marketers superpowers. But how can they wield those powers for most impact, and how should they be leveraging them ethically? And most importantly, how can AI enable more effective outcomes? Today, we are excited to share a fascinating conversation that covers so many topics that we know are of interest to product teams. We're speaking with Dr. Amy Bucher, Ph.D. She's the Chief Behavioral Officer at Lirio, where she leads a team of behavioral scientists and health experts focused on designing AI-powered behavior change journeys to drive better personal and population health outcomes. She brings over 15 years of experience in digital health product design, coupled with deep behavioral science training. Amy is a recognized expert on applying the psychology of motivation to design, and also the author of Engaged, Designing for Behavior Change. In today's episode, we speak with her about a whole range of topics, including how AI can open entire new possibilities for behavior change and lead to monumental outcomes, the opportunities and risks of leveraging AI personalization, reinforcement learning and what it is, objective-driven AI, and how we should start focusing more on outcomes, why wearables may open new possibilities, the considerations around proprietary versus commercially available AI, and finally, why having an AI scientist will be critical for any team, and that it may not be as hard to hire for as you think.
Speaking with Amy makes one thing very clear. We're moving into an era where true personalization is finally possible. It'll open enormous possibilities to innovate any behavior outcome-oriented industry. This might be healthcare, education, politics, e-commerce, or advertising. It will also change how product teams and marketers will need to architect their communication systems. Rules-based marketing automation will be replaced by ones that can interpret your goal, context, and individualized journey. Over the last decade, we've been looking at marketing automation monolithically, where we break customers based into segments and cohorts. We develop rules and criteria for how people within those groups would get slightly different wording and components. But overall, it was a very top-down approach and about just micro-personalization, let's be honest. The analogy here is mass media and how brands communicate slightly differently depending on which channel you're communicating them with and their demographics related to those channels. Everything is just slight iterations. But in the future, we might be able to start looking at groups of people from the perspective of what they want to accomplish and their individual stories. Your communication evolves as you take steps forwards and backwards. It will understand what you're trying to accomplish and perhaps some of the changes along the way. The analogy here is walking in anywhere that you might receive high-touch service, be it a hotel, luxury store, or working with a real estate agent. They assess how you walk, the questions you ask, listen to you deeply, and build an approach that's personalized as much as possible to you. AI can make this possible very soon, and orgs should start planning for it. I hope you get as much from this conversation with Amy as I did.
Hi, Amy. Thank you so much for joining us today. You wrote your book, Engaged, Designing for Behavior Change, in 2019. It was used by researchers and designers and touched on topics of persuasive design and behavioral science. Can you quickly tell us about a few of the key themes that you found have particularly resonated with product teams?
Sure. And thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here talking with you both. I would say one of the big reasons I even wrote the book in the first place is as I got deeper into my profession of behavioral design, of applying behavioral science to these traditional UX type activities, particularly in the research area, and then taking research insights to shape up product requirements. I got a lot of curiosity when I attended events that were more on the UX or product side about, well, how do you do this? What are the tools? What resources can you point me to so I can do more of this? And there weren't any of those resources available. I didn't know of a singular place I could point people to. And so that was sort of my goal in writing the book. And I wrote it specifically for that audience. So for people who don't have a deep background necessarily in behavioral science And so on the flip side, the feedback that I've gotten about what is useful, it's been very validating for me, is that I achieved something like what I'd hoped, which is somebody who doesn't have much of a background in behavioral science can come away understanding some concepts about human behavior that are directly relevant to the work of product management and product design, that there are some specific processes and systems in the book that I talk about. So I talk about, for example, using the COM-B model as a way to understand what might be stopping somebody from doing a behavior. And that model, first of all, is very straightforward. So again, you don't need a PhD to understand or use it, but it also overlaps really nicely with a lot of the activities that product folks do. So the feedback I've generally gotten is this is actually useful to me. And again, that's so validating because that was my hope in writing it.
It was really useful to me. Thank you.
Well, thank you. See, that means a lot.
Amazing. There's a lot of conversation these days about how do we arm product teams with consumer insights, with, getting them closer to the customer. And, you wrote this book before the pandemic, before GenAI really came to the forefront of public consciousness. So thinking about, especially around the opportunities with AI, how would you update or rewrite that book for today?
Yeah, and I definitely would need to revisit a lot of the book in light of what's happened with AI over the last few years. So the book actually was published on March 3rd, 2020, kind of the week everything started to shut down. And I'll tell you, just as an aside, the cover, Rosenfeld Media, my publisher, always uses the same design firm out of Philadelphia for all of their covers. They do a really great job, and they work kind of abstractly. The creative briefs that I had for them talked a lot about change metaphors. And so my cover is based on this idea of a kaleidoscope. I had so many people when the book was first out ask me if it was a stylized version of the coronavirus. I am not that prescient, and if I were, I would not have put it on the cover of the book. So it's intended to be a kaleidoscope metaphor. But part of what happened during the pandemic, in addition to this general explosion of AI capabilities, is first of all, when I was still at MadPow, which is where I was when I wrote the book, we started to get really interested in AI and how do we do service design? How do we do behavioral design in an AI world? Like, where do we plug into that process? And so I had started thinking and writing a little bit about that. And then I received my offer to join Lirio, where I am today. And we have AI as one of the key parts of our offering. So we use something called reinforcement learning as a mechanism to personalize the way that we talk to people. And so I've learned a lot about AI in the last 4 years since the book came out. And I think one of the things that has come to my attention is really important is behavioral scientists, product designers, UX people. I think we all understand the ways that AI could superpower the things that we build, but we don't have a good shared understanding of what AI is. And I've been very fortunate that I work alongside an AI science team with a chief AI scientist who is very willing to talk to me like I'm in fourth grade. But one of the things that I've really learned from working with him is that, even coming in after all that experience doing my own research before I worked in this company, I didn't really understand what AI is and what AI isn't. And I was using the term very loosely, and I was using it to refer to a lot of different things. And so I think one of the things that I would want to do if I were to rewrite Engaged is to offer a little bit of a primer of what are the big subtypes of AI out there? What types of purposes might you use them for as a product person or a designer? Generative AI is good for some things, but it is not by any means all of the things out there for AI. I mean, you have recommender systems, you have things like reinforcement learning that my team uses that help us to personalize content. I think understanding what's under the hood of AI a little bit can be really helpful. And I also think understanding that helps you make decisions sometimes about whether or not you need it. So there could be, for example, a rules-based mechanism that allows you to achieve the same objective as AI without necessarily having to tap into that computer processing power and kind of the complex mechanics of setting up an AI system. So definitely that primer of AI. I also have a section in Engaged already about ethics, and that's something that's really important to me in general. I think as behavioral scientists and really anything that we design that gets into a consumer's hands, it has the opportunity to do harm as well as good. And we need to think carefully about how we design things so that we are either neutral or doing good. And when I say neutral, people have their own goals, their own reasons for using things. And if somebody wants to use my product in a way that I didn't imagine they're using it, but it helps them with their goal, I feel like that's maybe, as a designer, I had a neutral stance, but that's ultimately a good thing that I'm helping this person go towards their goal. I think it's really important with AI, again, because people don't always realize when it shows up. We don't realize when it's in the products that we're using necessarily. I pay a lot of attention to it, and I'm still sometimes surprised when I'm like, wait a minute, why did Microsoft Word just finish my sentence for me? Oh, there must be AI in the background now that wasn't there before. I do think there's an ethical obligation for us to make people aware when we can, when these things are part of their product experience, and especially when there's implications for how their data is being accessed and used. We generate so much data moving about the world now. And I think most people, I'll even include myself as someone who works in this space, I don't have a full understanding of how all of my data is used, who's using it, what purposes they're using it for. And I think there's something there around the ethics that I probably haven't quite shaped up yet that would need to come out for product folks to think about too when using AI.
I love that you talked about the language and the definitions around AI as well. Even just thinking about that, a couple of weeks ago, we were speaking with Emily Campbell, who's working on this whole sort of design system project about the UX of AI. And she spoke quite a bit about this idea of adaptive AI, which is personalized content, learning paths, things like that. But from my understanding, that is very much about reinforcement learning and very much about taking the feedback of the user and then adapting what's happening. What are your thoughts on kind of those two different terms and where those two terms kind of coexist? So adaptive AI versus, reinforcement learning.
My understanding, and again, this is an area where I'm still getting my education, is that those two terms overlap but are not identical. They're not synonymous with each other. So I think, based on my understanding, reinforcement learning is a specific type of approach. It has a target for the algorithm to achieve, which in our case is going to be a behavior that somebody performs. There's some kind of reward function associated with that target, and then the algorithm is performing to achieve the award. And so what's happening is, as it does or does not achieve the award, it's sort of learning what approach works, and that's where the personalization comes from. So I think that's a type of adaptive AI. But if I think of something like a recommender system, so if you think of, say, Amazon, when you're on a product page and it's telling you people like you like this product, or maybe you would also like to put this in your cart, I don't believe that the mechanism for that to happen is reinforcement learning, but I would consider that adaptive AI because my understanding is that that changes over time based on other people's shopping patterns, your own shopping patterns, and those recommendations may not look the same 3 weeks from now as they do today. So I think adaptive AI is an overarching category, but again, this is one of those areas where I think as a field, AI scientists are a very mature field themselves. These are people with PhDs in mathematics and computer science. And we're just starting to get smart to what they're doing. And I'm just more and more learning there's a lot of work for us to do in terms of understanding that vocabulary and being able to situate the terms properly.
I think we can all agree that right now we're still at a very early stage where the capabilities are more theoretical than actually out in market. A lot of what we're talking about has been proven in academic papers, but not so much in actual business functions. If we look forward 5 years from now, what are some capabilities specifically around personalization that you believe will be really impactful?
I think that we will be able to do more with reinforcement learning than we're doing today. And to your point, two of my colleagues and I have a paper under review right now, which is a scoping review of how are people using AI in digital behavior change interventions. And we specifically focused on things that are coaching or impacting real world behaviors. So there's a lot of AI tools out there, especially in the mental health space, that are really kind of constrained to the app. You're interacting with a chatbot or exercises that are on the screen, but you're not doing anything outside of the digital environment. So we excluded those. And one of the things, to your point, I think there were 23 different technologies that we were able to identify that are using some kind of real AI in a digital intervention to change real world behavior. And of those 23, I want to say 20 were academic or research oriented, like not commercially available, and no clear path, at least from what I could tell, that they would become a consumer facing product despite a lot of promise. So I think, first of all, there is this opportunity where there are actually some really cool tools being researched. And my hope is that, the academic folks who are working on them would work with their innovation offices at their universities, for example, and start to see about commercializing those, whether it's creating a business entity that is around the product, selling that product to somebody who can use it commercially, a health system or an insurance company or a big technology company. Like I know Microsoft acquires a lot of smaller capabilities and builds them into their ecosystem. So that's one opportunity, I think, is just take these little pockets of academic innovation and spin them out for broader use. There's also one of the things we noticed in that scoping review is that the evidence collected to date around the use of AI, it's really early stage stuff. So it's what I would call leading indicators. It's like in 30 days, did people actually use this tool more because there was AI? In 30 days, did people take more steps? When we think about healthcare, which is where all of my work is, 30 days, that's a start. But if we're talking about something like managing diabetes, that's a lifelong proposition. So I think something we need to do is gather that longer term evidence. What happens 6 months down the road or a year down the road when someone's using these tools? Are we seeing that their A1C values actually improve as a result of this, not just their satisfaction with the app? I think as we prove those things out, we'll start to identify specific ways that personalization is more effective and for what types of behaviors. One of the things that I'm already seeing is that we might want to take slightly different personalization approaches to what I'll call more episodic behaviors. So things like seeing your doctor for a cancer screening, which happens once in a while, versus daily behaviors. So again, if you have diabetes, you're probably testing your blood sugar several times a day. You're probably, counting the carbs in the food that you eat, like these things that infiltrate the entirety of your day. I don't think that those experiences need to be personalized the same way. They shouldn't be personalized the same way. You might need to sort of really lean in and put a heavier communication on something that happens once in a while, as opposed to something that happens every day, where it's more about supporting the habit formation, creating the context where people remember to do the thing, and then ultimately it becomes part of their routine.
This Design of AI episode is brought to you by PH1 Research, an innovation research consultancy that specializes in turning business questions into product decisions. Over the last decade, PH1 has helped client teams discover, conceptualize, and test product improvements and net new ideas. This has included executive briefings about how to leverage AI and researching which specific use cases and tools your customers want. PH1 has worked on projects for Spotify, Microsoft, the National Football League, Dell, Mozilla, Bell, and various health and higher education groups. With capabilities across product discovery research, service design, rapid prototyping, and in-market testing, PH1 has been a key ally of product and product marketing teams. Visit their website to book an intro call, www.ph1.ca. You mentioned that you've moved over recently-ish, it was a couple of years ago, to Lirio, a company that specializes in applying artificial intelligence to healthcare. Can you share some examples of how you've worked at Lirio on leveraging AI to improve health outcomes?
Yeah. We have a product called precision nudging. And, the term nudging is probably familiar to anybody who follows behavioral science type stuff. The idea is that instead of creating a nudge that's universal for a population, everybody who comes and sees this message because the button is designed a certain way or because we've taken advantage of a particular cognitive bias, we'll get more people. We actually personalize what nudges are seen by what people. So we're trying to understand something about what might actually be stopping somebody from doing a health behavior, and then how do we give them the right personalized nudge that will overcome that barrier, help them think differently about it, help them avoid it entirely in some cases. So we work with all different types of healthcare organizations, so health systems, provider systems, insurance companies. We have a large retail pharmacy that we've been working with nationally around vaccination interventions. And our goal really is to work with their clinical teams to understand what patient or consumer behaviors are driving positive outcomes. So we're typically taking something of a population health lens there. It might be something like reducing hypertension within a population, which we're doing with one health system. Or I mentioned, major retail pharmacy really focusing on vaccination. And we started with RSV vaccination, which was brand new last year for people age 60 and older. And we're communicating with people basically via the channels that these organizations already use. A lot of times that ends up being email and text message, which I actually really like because that also helps with health equity. We don't need people to have a fancy app or, a wearable in order for us to influence their behavior. But we could. Our technology is capable of interfacing with those sorts of things as well, or, pushing app notifications with that right nudge. We are reaching out to these populations, and the reinforcement learning is selecting from a library of content that my team builds that's all based in behavioral science. It's all designed to correspond to those barriers people might have to the health behavior. And the reinforcement learning's job is really to pick the correct message for each person for that behavior, for that time. The really cool thing is because we're working with these entities that touch different aspects of health behavior, as we interact with people across different domains, we can start to build this representation of them as a person that crosses behaviors. And so we've been introducing this year this concept of the large behavior model, which we want to sort of stand up in parallel to a large language model or an LLM. So the LBM is really that representation of the person across contexts that we're able to develop as we continue to interact with them. And one of the really cool things about it is we can start to identify, are there characteristics of the person that are sort of constant and influence all of their behaviors? And one that I always think of is like your health insurance might make a difference in all of your health behaviors because you're sort of coming back to the same, will they pay for it? I know that this is a difficult insurer to work with and there's a lot of paperwork, or I have a really great insurance plan, so I don't ever have to worry about the cost. That would probably affect most, if not all, of your health behaviors versus something like a needle phobia, which might affect your willingness to get a vaccine, but not necessarily stop you from getting a mammogram. And so as we build this representation of the person and we understand these characteristics and kind of which behaviors they apply to, we can get better and better at personalizing the right way more quickly.
That sounds really interesting and really amazing. So me as a cognitive scientist also super fascinated by this idea of the large behavior model. But for people that are building product where we're already feeling overwhelmed and a bit immense in the world of data, what is some advice or some things you've learned in working on building out something like a large behavior model that you could help advise people just starting out or just starting to think about even better ways to use the data that's available to them to build out their products?
So first of all, I go back to kind of the foundational approaches that I outlined and engaged, which is really, I don't think I necessarily use this terminology, but I do think of let's build out a journey map. What is the action path that we're asking our users to follow? And what are the various points at which data could benefit that path? And then what data? So getting really organized up front about what you need and why, I think can be very helpful. And I do know that it's difficult with AI technology too, to have the discipline or the knowledge to not just throw the kitchen sink in there, especially because some of these algorithms will sort out which data are meaningful in the situation. We're getting better and better as we accumulate experience and data about identifying up front. We just kind of know that this is not going to be necessary data, but this is absolutely necessary data. We've shaped up something we call our slim data model, which is sort of the bare minimum necessary data to stand up any project. And we find we often start there because it's less overwhelming to our clients. It's obviously allows us to get up and running more quickly in a client environment. And oftentimes because we're also generating data by having a working product, the interactions that people have with precision nudging give us new information that doesn't exist anywhere else. We don't necessarily need to start off with a really heavy bolt of information to be effective. The other thing that we're doing more work on that I'm excited about, but we haven't yet seen the results of, is something that I've sometimes called warm starting our algorithms or our agents, which is when we do our behavioral science literature reviews, when we're building out our logic models, we will sometimes see in the literature that there are characteristics of a person that are related to a particular barrier. So just as a really straightforward example, if we're nudging people around diabetes, there are people of ethnic and racial backgrounds where they are genetically more predisposed to diabetes and sometimes like at a lower body weight, for example. And so if we know that we're talking to people who are pre-diabetic and, maybe have the propensity to develop diabetes soon, and we also know that they belong to one of these racial or ethnic groups where that propensity is even greater, that's something that we can use right away. We don't have to wait to learn something about the individual to personalize around that barrier. Like you might not be aware of your personal risk. We can just start off with day one, like, because we know this is more likely than not true, let's start here. And if we're wrong about that, the AI will figure that out pretty quickly. So we don't have to continue down a road that's not fruitful. But, base rates, right? Statistics tell us we might be more right than if we randomly did our first outreach. So something like that is a way that we can kind of use data knowledgeably, going back to the existing research and saying this data element might be important because there's previous findings that suggest it's related to this behavior or related to the way that people think about this behavior.
Now, what you're talking about really sparks a question in my mind, which is you're talking about that this technology enables organizations to be outcome focused, but from the individual perspective, not from the business perspective. Whereas an organization might say, I want to convert 5,000 or 40% of people. We want, these people to reach status level 5 or completion level C or whatever it may be. That seems like a major shift in how you can look at who you're serving, why you're serving them, and what success looks like. Marketers obviously work in organizations that usually are working for KPIs. They're not looking at an individualistic level. How can we help those organizations shift that perspective?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that actually, because when I was talking about AI terminology earlier, a thing I overlooked saying is just in the last 8 or 9 months, Jan LeCun at Meta has introduced this term of objective driven AI, which is what we believe we're doing at Lirio. And it's where we're really identifying these outcomes, these metrics that we need to achieve. And then everything that the AI does is in service of that. I think that this is almost a perspective switching game as opposed to any real disagreement. So the KPIs that you see marketing teams or other corporate teams anchored on, a lot of times in order to achieve them, they do need to influence individual behavior, even if they're not thinking about it that way. It's the things that all of the different people in your population do that ultimately ladder up to those. In healthcare, a lot of the organizations we work with, they may be looking to achieve a certain score on the STARS metrics for CMS. They may be looking to close what's called a gap in care, where they know that a large percentage of their patients aren't doing something that's clinically recommended and really important for outcomes. And they're thinking about it from that population level. Like, we just need to get more people to do this. Part of my job is to translate that down one layer deeper and say, okay, when you say people, that's a collection of individuals. How do we personalize those individuals so that collectively they are getting, into the same behavioral wavelength? So, it gets kind of boils down to like groups are people and people are different. And if we can figure out a scalable way to personalize the way we talk to people, we can mobilize the group.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've worked, off and on with healthcare clients throughout the years. And oftentimes those platforms and interventions struggle to align with what people actually want or need. So for example, we worked on a pretty big project for tobacco and nicotine cessation. And this is an area where there is a lot of funding and there is a lot of interest, but the bureaucracy often dictated the programs rather than what people actually needed or what would drive that behavior change. And really, people want to feel heard. They want to feel community. They want to feel cared for and supported, regardless of what type of technology they have available or accessible to them. So, oftentimes having to go to libraries or use work computers and, the environments with which they were having to use these programs didn't necessarily match up, and often also makes it more difficult for that personalization. So thinking about the new opportunities for personalization and for these sort of care plans that can happen because of AI, what's some advice that you would have for smaller products or smaller teams that maybe are starting much further back than we wish they were?
First of all, I want to say I love your question. And I think what you just described about how much people want to be seen and cared for is why I've spent so much of my career focused on personalization specifically, because I think that's exactly right. I think if we want to motivate people too over the long term, it has to be something that they want, that supports their values and their life goals, or else we're going to be in a business of constantly putting nudges in front of people at every step. And that's just it's not feasible. And it's, probably if we play it out to its logical endgame, not particularly ethical either. So I think there's work that we can do in the way that we talk to people and design experiences that helps them to think about their own goals in alignment with what the product is trying to do. So, in healthcare, a lot of times we might be asking people to do something that's kind of clinical. You need to be getting into compliance with the recommended cancer screening schedule or the recommended vaccination schedule. And that's not particular. Like, I don't know anybody who sits around saying my personal goal is to be in compliance with recommended cancer screenings. But people do have goals like, I want to be the healthiest I can be for as long as I can be, or, I watched one of my parents go through a health crisis and I want to avoid that for myself. If we can start to understand some of the ways people think about their own health and their own health goals and adjust our language and our approach to either mimic that or to make it very clear how the things we're talking about are actually in support of each other. If we can help you if we can prevent you getting a communicable disease because you're up to date on your vaccines, then you're going to enjoy your vacation instead of spending half of it sick in a hotel room. Or, if we can catch cancer early, then that means you might not have the outcome that your mom had when she caught her cancer late. So there's a bit there where it's about the content, the way that we understand people, what are we doing with the data? And I think to some extent, a human in the loop can be helpful there, which might be encouraging for companies that are just starting out and figuring out where AI could help. you think about AI too, and AI typically needs some kind of training data, and there might be something about doing the human work up front, doing the sort of manual hands-on, let's learn about our users, but then that becomes something that informs the way you develop AI. The other thing that I see a big opportunity in, and I kind of can't believe I'm saying this because I do work for a company that has its own proprietary AI approach, but when we did our scoping review, I was really surprised. Only 2 of the technologies that we identified were using like non-proprietary AI, something that they had licensed or something that they had built using commercially available pieces. So like, Microsoft tools, for example. And I understand why there's a commercial advantage to having something that you own and that you've developed and that nobody else exactly has. But at the same time, when everybody's using something proprietary, it becomes difficult to tell the quality. It becomes difficult to make comparisons. There could be 3 companies that all say they're doing reinforcement learning, but are they? What does it look like under the hood? Can we really compare apples to apples there? And so I think there might be an opportunity when people are starting out to actually use commercially available technologies, to license things, to try using tools that are already out there. And then as they figure out what that looks like in their environment, they can shift to something that's proprietary, or maybe stay with the thing that's commercially available. I think ultimately we do need to have more people sharing the undergirding technology if we want to start making some of these comparisons.
Feels very personal. It feels very distinct. I know one of the problems with healthcare outcomes is that people are intimidated by asking for help. They feel like their situation is distinctly theirs. There's an irony in here when we start looking from a broader lens, which is, someone listening to this podcast might think, well, my marketing is different from this. Marketing is simpler. We don't have to deal with all these human issues. But when I go back about 17 years ago, I was working on building a personalization system. I went through, spot audited what people's journey was through using the system. And I started identifying pre-churn behaviors that would happen. And there were flags that you could identify and build. And if you could identify those flags, you can limit the potential churn that happens down the pipe. But the irony is a lot of marketers are so focused on KPIs that they're looking at the absolute numbers, X actually churned, X converted. When a lot of this journey, just like addiction, is about going forwards and backwards and forwards and backwards and sideways and backwards. And I feel like one of the big lessons I'm hoping we can take away today is that marketing now has the ability and the capability to look at people more holistically, look at the questions they have, their journeys, both good and bad, and start planning around things that before seemed impossible. I'm just wondering if you can comment on what you've seen as, a reformed marketer in terms of how to build real journeys that deal with the real human condition.
I think one of the things that's really cool about AI tools is that they will be better than humans at reacting to unanticipated changes in people's journeys. So one of the things early in my career that was sometimes challenging is that we were essentially hard coding the way that we would communicate with people all along this journey, which required us to map it out in advance and try to predict what are the steps this person will go through, what support will they need at each step. And I would say, that was correct more often than not, because we were rooting that in really good research and a really good understanding of the people that we were reaching out to. But I mean, look at the pandemic in 2020. Who predicted that, right? And who predicted all the ways that it would? I shouldn't say who predicted that. I'm sure there were people who did predict that, but I didn't predict that. And I certainly didn't build it into the way that I was doing my product work, thinking that, in 2021, someone will be using this really differently than they are today in 2019. I think a technology tool might be better able to quickly recognize if the way that you're communicating with somebody is no longer effective and change tactics, which is a lot of what precision nudging is doing. And one of the reasons that I think it's so cool, it's like if something that previously was effective for this individual isn't working anymore, we don't even need to know the reason. The algorithm can sort of start to suss out like, oh, this isn't effective. Let's try something different. And they do that whole explore, exploit, journey themselves, where they're trying to figure out like, what is the thing that we can say to this person? So I think there's that. And, I do think that a lot of marketing teams they like automation and they're drawn to automation tools, but many of these automation tools are still using hard-coded algorithms under the hood. So I don't want to name any specific platforms, but there's a couple that we've seen, some of our clients using, where they do have to go through and they have to say, if this person does this thing, send this message. And that opens the opportunity to miss, what if the person doesn't do that thing? Or what if they do it, but they do it for reasons that are different than you think they're doing it, and that communication isn't really addressing what they need to hear. I think this again gets back to the whole terminology thing, because I know for a fact that some of the teams who are using these sort of hard-coded automated journey tools think that they are AI based. And to my best understanding, they're typically not. So anything that doesn't learn, anything that's hard-coded like that, really cool and scalable technology, but probably not meeting the modern definition of AI. So yeah, and I get it's really hard. What's measured matters. And I think one of the things you keep coming back to is that these teams are measured on certain KPIs, right? Their success as business people, as teams, depends on them meeting these KPIs. And so I can't fault them for relying on tactics that have been effective there in the past. But I think that ultimately, if they take the leap of faith and start using something that is more personalized, is doing some of this autonomous learning, that they will ultimately do better at those KPIs than they are now.
It is interesting how, from a consumer perspective, we're still in that place where these hard-coded algorithms or these hard-coded journeys and conversations, I think will still have a place, because that's where a lot of product teams are very comfortable still. Like, we've spent so long working on those and investing in them and having to implement them and test them and prototype and iterate, right? And now we're at a place where we're kind of saying, take a leap of faith. Assume that this computer will know better than, this last 10 years worth of work that we've just been doing. And as someone who has been taking that leap of faith, how do you sell that into a business?
Yeah. And, even as you were saying that, I'm like, well, maybe I don't have enough empathy here towards people who are struggling with this, because there are actually places where I'm not ready to take the leap of faith either. Because I think there are places where AI is not ready for prime time. And again, I'll keep going back to healthcare because that's where I live. But I use reinforcement learning to personalize behavioral messages that go out to people. But every single one of those behavioral messages is handwritten by an expert on my team who has behavioral science training. We go through a quality assurance process where we have a behavioral designer look at that content and basically ensure that it's operationalizing the behavior change technique correctly. We're not letting generative AI get involved in the game. We've explored it a little bit, but we don't feel comfortable that the quality is consistent enough. It still hallucinates. Even with something like retrieval assisted generation, RAG, which can make the output of generative AI more aligned with what you wanted to say, I still don't feel assured 100% that would do the trick, where I would want to take the risk of offering, a patient something that was created by AI and not vetted by that human expert. So I feel that, actually. I understand why you might not want to take the risk. And I think one of the things that's been helpful to me, also, I went through this myself when I was interviewing for my job at Lirio. At every single interview that I had, I asked the person I was talking to tell me about, what's your ethical approach? How do you think about using this tool? And what made me comfortable to move to this company was that it was something everyone was thoughtful about. I wouldn't say anyone had the answer, but the fact that they all had an answer to that question, they were thinking about that, gave me the comfort to say, I will work in this new space. And I think when we're talking to these teams, that's probably part of it, not coming in and saying we have the answer, but coming in and saying we're willing to have this conversation with you. We want to understand, what are you trying to achieve with your current approach? And then again, this working with the AI experts, being really clear about the vocabulary, like working with a chief AI scientist, for me, part of what that's given me is he can tell me hey, this AI tool is really well vetted. This is something that the industry feels super good about. It's very reliable. We know exactly how it works. And then there's other places where this is experimental. This is new. This is the gap that still exists with this tool. Having someone who's part of the larger conversation, who brings that particular expertise and who is able to be in the conversation where they're listening to your objectives as a marketer, as a product person, is really important. So yeah, I think bringing that expert in the room can help as well. But it is an uncomfortable transition.
I'm wondering about that. There's obviously a lot of groups who are SMBs, small, medium, and they can't afford to get the headcount for an AI scientist or head of AI. Are there resources they can leverage, fractional consulting or otherwise?
I haven't explored that specifically. So one thing I will say, Lirio is also a small business. We have about 60 people on staff. And one of the things that our CEO, Martin Denherring, will frequently say, and I will just, I don't know what anybody makes, but he'll talk about, the caliber of AI scientists we have could get a job at, Google or Meta. and make much more money. But part of the reason that we have been able to attract a really talented team is that we lead with mission. And I kind of think that is important. The people, the specific individuals I work with who are AI scientists, 201 will tell you how it matters to them that they're applying their skills to improve people's lives. We want to get people to healthcare. A lot of our colleagues have personal stories about themselves or a loved one who was really helped out by getting connected with healthcare at the right point in their journey. So I think there's maybe more hope than people might anticipate. And there are very few companies that are paying those Meta and Google salaries. There's, I think, a perception sometimes that more companies have that kind of payroll than really do. So I would first of all say it might be worth seeing what it would cost you. But yeah, there are organizations. One that we've gotten involved with is called CHAI, CHAI. And of course, I think it's Center for Healthcare AI. But that, I think those sorts of interest groups might be a place where you can start to build a network, talk to people, see who's interested. I'm also seeing more and more universities who are spinning up centers that exist outside of an academic department and are specifically about bringing AI technology to various groups. I think there might be more pockets in universities where you're going to get academics who are probably willing to serve as consultants and are gaining experience and practice at applying what they've learned as AI specialists to different domains and fields.
Thank you so much. Now, changing gears a little bit, these AI models eat data, they devour it, they crave it.
Mm-hmm.
One category of tool or product that could be very beneficial to them are wearables and these very niche healthcare apps, whether these are ones that monitor your sleep, mood, ovulation habits, etc. Those types of tools and products were very trendy a couple of years ago, but they never appeared to get much adoption. Do you suspect that this type of tool will become a lot more critical in the infrastructure of collecting personal data?
I think it could be, and I kind of hope it will be. So one of the things that we've identified as an opportunity is sort of around what you said, which is if we're really trying to create this objective driven AI that has an objective like let's improve diabetes in the population. Let's get the population level A1C value lower. We have to go beyond just nudging people to go to the doctor or nudging people to get their labs drawn. And it has to start to be, how do we nudge and support people for these at-home behaviors, getting exercise, eating a certain way, measuring their blood pressure, and, especially if they've had a change in medication or change in diagnosis, taking that medication. And wearables can be a really critical input to those at-home in the moment behaviors. There is an approach in behavioral science that we're starting to incorporate into our product, but we could do much more with if we did have the wearable data. It's called just-in-time adaptive interventions, or JITI. And the idea is that it's much more real-time in terms of the nudging and feedback, and it's calibrated based on the person's data. So if you think about something like a wearable in a JITI kind of setup, if we wanted you to walk 10,000 steps a day, we could kind of monitor over the course of the day if you were doing good at that or not, and maybe basically give you more nuanced feedback than I think even the Apple Watch does today. So if we had that sort of data, I think we could get to a much more powerful place in terms of how we support people towards a bigger health objective. And I think one of the reasons that wearables maybe haven't taken off quite as much as their promise is that they often don't integrate with anything else, or they integrate with a very few select things that are in a specific domain. So like I have a Garmin and I can integrate it with Strava, but I can't integrate it with like my chart if I'm doing something that's related to a health diagnosis. So I think having some kind of hub where people can put this wearable data and make sense of it in light of health conditions and other health things, and it's not just reliant on these like micro partnerships between specific organizations, might really help that wearable market live into its promise.
That's actually one of the biggest challenges that I have with AI right now altogether, is just everything is disparate. And so it doesn't necessarily feel like we have one place where we can own all of that data. On a side note, in China, they recently actually started rolling out urinals where you could pay a fee and it will do a urinalysis on your urine as you're just going to the bathroom. What are your thoughts on new innovative ways of trying to get that data and give people health interventions in ways that meet them where they are?
I'm smiling because it feels like everything old is new again to me. I remember maybe like 10 or so years ago, I want to say it's Toto, but if it's not, I'm so sorry, Toto. A toilet company out of Asia that was doing something similar for fecal analysis. And, we don't see that commercially on the market. And I remember as well, like when I was working at Johnson & Johnson, this is still an ongoing project. There's a community in Orlando called Lake Nona. So it's kind of a planned community. It's pretty new. And they built it specifically to appeal to people who are like 40 and up, but more, health focused, lifestyle focused. And they're doing a longitudinal study there that they intend to be an analog to the Framingham Heart Study. So really looking at wellness, longevity, and they have all these different companies, J&J included, who have sponsored various aspects of this study and contributed to them. And I remember when it was first shaping up, it's probably 2013, we were talking to companies who were like, yeah, we're going to put sensors throughout the homes in Lake Nona, and like we'll be able to track, are people getting up in the middle of the night? So I think there's been a lot of imagination around these sorts of unobtrusive, sensor-based ways of measuring and monitoring people's behavior, but then ultimately using it in the service of like coaching and supporting and, nudging behavior changes. But I don't know that there's really been a lot of action beyond concept since I first started hearing about it. So I think it would be potentially really exciting. But again, I think it's going to come back to transparency and consent. It's probably a good thing that that's a pay urinal. Like, I think it would be pretty upsetting to people if they were, at a ballpark or a stadium and using the bathroom and all of a sudden, like, somebody knows something about their health that they didn't explicitly consent to have known. But I think for people who are interested in that, it probably is a very exciting thing. And it's probably the sort of thing where you'll see an early adopter crowd, the folks who buy the first Cybertruck are also the first ones to buy like the special urinal or pay for that. But if it works and if we introduce it in a way that feels ethical, that people feel is ethical, like not that we feel is ethical as product designers, but the person who's using it feels like, I know what I'm signing up for and I agree to this. I could see something like that having legs as the sort of data infrastructure evolves to be able to support it finally.
One of the big questions that I think everyone has in the general population is always what tools are actually useful. And you even mentioned it as one of the reasons why you wrote your book in the first place is where do we start? What can we trust? What can we vet? Because we don't all have a chief AI officer at our disposal. So what AI tools have you personally found to be useful or are you most excited about?
I don't use a lot of AI tools actually outside of what Lirio uses in our product. I do have a subscription to ChatGPT, and I was excited about the new 4.0. I'm not sure how they verbalize the name of it that came out. I don't use it for, like real purposes, I guess. I do a lot of experimenting with it. I will engage, like I engaged in a really fun conversation with it about the movie Twins with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito and tried to see if I could get it to agree that they were really twins, which I also like. And, for me, that's just a fun exercise. And like, what does prompt engineering look like? And what is this tool actually capable of doing? I have used it at times to help generate ideas. So like I was giving a talk and I was struggling with the title and, here's a talk description, give me 10 titles to choose from. And that gives me things that I can riff off of. So I do think like generative AI can be really useful for those sorts of things. And I've heard from some of my colleagues, especially in the content development area, that while they don't like to use it to write content, they do sometimes like it if they have a sort of writer's block or, there's this really complex concept and I need a 2-word phrase to describe it. They've said ChatGPT can be very helpful for that. So there's that. But the other thing I have been personally doing is I've been trying to learn and educate myself. And I have found that there's kind of a class of academic pop press books that has been helpful for me in trying to learn more about AI. So I did a LinkedIn post recently about a few of those. There's a class of academic popular press book that I found really helpful in terms of my own education about AI that then helped me figure out what tools I want to work with or how I want to interface with them. So one that I really liked was called Power and Prediction. And that was really more about the business context of AI. So I found it helped me think a little bit differently about some of the work we're doing at Lirio and some of the ways that we think about, using an MVP sort of version of a tool to learn and gather data and improve it. So that one was really good. I've also really benefited from some of the books that talk about the pitfalls of using data and ways that we need to think about using it ethically. So, Weapons of Math Destruction by Kathy O'Neil is a really good one. Algorithms of Oppression is a very, I think, well-known one. Atlas of AI is one that I read that was kind of depressing, Kate Crawford. So this one really focused on some of the environmental impacts of AI, which I think is a huge drawback. And it's something that bothers me a little bit about the work that I do because, I do care about the environment and sustainability. And obviously AI requires a tremendous amount of computing power. And so I think that one area that will be important for people to think about is how do we make this a more sustainable technology? And some of that is going to be how do we use better judgment about the data that we intake as well as output. But yeah, so for me, it's using commercially available tools like generative AI just to understand them, play around with them. And sometimes they are suited for a very specific purpose in my personal workflow. And then also just educating myself broadly so that I can figure out where these things fit.
Are there any tools, AI or otherwise, that can help people understand at whatever level they're at what all these academic journals are trying to say? Because we're overwhelmed by the amount of research happening. And for us normies out there, it's a little hard to know what it means.
Yeah, I feel a little bit in the same boat, actually. So that project that I just did with my colleagues, which is under review right now for a journal, is my first attempt to help with that. So we're like, let's take an assessment of what's actually out there. Let's put it into a format that we hope is pretty easy for people to understand and have that kind of be the foundation where now we can go back and do the next run through. So there's that. I personally benefit a lot, I think, from following people on LinkedIn. So I would recommend people follow my colleague, Chris Simons, who is the chief AI scientist at Lirio. He hasn't posted a ton, but I know that that's going to change. And we're actually planning to start doing a semi-regular audio recording where we just chat about the work that we're doing. And we're intending for that to be kind of casual and conversational, thinking that maybe that will help people hear how two different disciplines actually talk about these tools. I mentioned Jan LeCun from Meta. He's someone who I recently started following on there. I'm very fortunate working for a company that does AI that I have kind of guides who can point out to me. We have a Slack internally where we have a channel that's, AI news. And so I do get a lot of AI news from there. And again, it's a lens as to what's reputable, what do I pay attention to. I mentioned that Chai is another organization that has good reputable information on AI, but yeah, I think it is very, very hard, especially as a non-AI scientist, to get into the academic literature on your own and figure out where to go. So for the most part, my bias is let's see what the sort of influencers, the trustworthy experts are saying and go from there.
One that I've found has been pretty robust that I've liked so far, just in playing around with it a little bit, is actually called SciSpace. So it's a co-pilot, and it does a really nice job of its database is basically only published scientific journal papers.
Yeah, I actually should have said I haven't used SciSpace, but I will try that now. I've used a couple of the AI tools that are designed to help you like find articles. And those can actually be really helpful because they recognize something about your search term sometimes that goes beyond just the semantics. And it's like, oh yeah, I wouldn't have found that paper if you didn't suggest it, but that's exactly the sort of thing I'm looking for.
There's also one called System Pro that I haven't tried around, but I want to, where it came out of academia, and apparently it's intended to not only identify different topics in academic literature, but then also peripheral topics that sort of are part of the same web that you can explore further as well.
All right. And closing out our conversation here with you, it's been wonderful. I'm wondering what kind of products, AI products, are you hoping or not hoping that the masters of all our personal data build? And these would be, Salesforce, Google, Meta. What are types of AI products you hope they build or that you hope they don't build?
Yeah, well, if I'm thinking about like myself as a consumer, I actually would love some of the streamlined, personalized, especially health coaching that I think I've been working in my career towards building. I find it's really difficult, and especially as I get older, and I'm relatively healthy, and I'm not, yeah, I'm middle aged. I'm not like at the end of my years, but I'm still finding that with each passing year, I kind of have another consideration when I'm making decisions about, oh, what does my overall diet look like? What kind of exercise plan is going to be best for me? What does my daily routine look like? I would actually love something that understood all of me, and especially if it was able to pull together things that I might not recognize as a human being are relevant for some of these health behaviors. My imagination is really caught by anything that can identify relationships that would otherwise escape notice. So if it was like, hey, when you go to bed at 11, you don't lift as many weights as when you go to bed at 12, like something like that. If technology could give me that sort of insight, I would be really excited by that personally. What I hope doesn't happen, like one thing that I'm personally a little disturbed by is all of the facial and biometric recognition technology. And I try to opt out of that as much as possible because I have this sense that, someone can steal my social security number or my credit card. And as much as it would be a huge pain to do so, I can replace those things. but I can't replace my retinas or my face or my handprint. So, our local grocery store is a Whole Foods, and they have this thing in there now where you can pay using a palm print. It's like a scanner that you put your hand on top of, and I will not use that. Or similarly, when you're flying and you go through TSA, they're using facial recognition now at a lot of the TSA points, and you are allowed to opt out of that. And so I do. And I've had a few TSA agents say to me, like, well, we have cameras all over the airport. I'm like, yeah, I know. But this particular camera is not how I want you to recognize that I'm the person I say I am. I don't know if my feelings about that will change as that technology continues to perpetuate. Like, I don't expect that to go away. It seems like people appreciate the convenience more than they're afraid of the potential drawbacks. But for me personally, that feels just risky, because your physical self, your biometrics, is something that if there were a security breach, you can't replace. And so that's where my personal kind of like fear is coming from right now.
Thank you so much, Amy. Where can people go to follow along on your lessons and learnings?
Yes, LinkedIn is probably the best place to find me. And then Lirio.com is where you'll find the work that I'm doing at Lirio. And as I mentioned, my colleague Chris Simons and I are going to hopefully start having a little bit of a more public-facing conversation on a regular basis, which I think we'll probably talk about through LinkedIn. So if you're interested in that, go to LinkedIn.
Thank you for listening to the Design of AI podcast. The show is hosted by Brittany Hobbs and Arpi Drag Figueredo. Subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple to get our latest episodes. We speak to leaders at the forefront of AI to learn how great AI products are designed and how they're transforming industries. To contact us, visit our website, designof.ai.